So I had maternal sepsis, although I didn't even know maternal sepsis was a thing until about a few weeks ago, and I saw someone mention that term on social media. But um, my sepsis actually happened 8 years ago. So I was pregnant with my second child, and it got to around 34 weeks of the pregnancy, and everything was going fine. When I suddenly started feeling a lot of pain in my like ribs in my side, and I'm quite small. I'm only 5'1", and I had the condition where you have excess fluid, and I knew the baby was a good size. So the first thing that happened when I went to A&E and I was seen, that the midwife recommended that I went to A&E, was they did an X-ray and they found a shadow like in the rib area, but they said that they thought it was actually just because I was quite petite and carrying a largish baby, that it was just a compression of my lung. So at that point, they weren't concerned. They just thought it was me complaining. But I had had a child before. So I think because it's my second pregnancy, I kind of knew what felt normal and what didn't feel normal. And I was just really aware that this pain that was building didn't feel normal to me. But of course, you have to trust the experts. And I definitely don't blame them for that misdiagnosis at that stage. But they sent me home and I just thought, I need to get on with it. I am 34 weeks pregnant. I know that it's exhausting for the body to be carrying a baby at that stage. But over the next few days, I continued to deteriorate, and it came to the point that I could hardly breathe. So my breathing was really shallow. And again, I thought it's because I'm carrying a baby in my body. Of course, it's harder to breathe, but my breathing was so shallow. It was so hard to get my breath. And then, so at that point, they thought maybe it was pneumonia. So I ended up being treated for pneumonia. And under the pneumonia consultant, I was given pneumonia medication. And obviously, it wasn't pneumonia at this point. But again, that's, I think, the tricky part about sepsis is it can be so difficult for people to identify. And I hadn't even heard anyone suggest it might be sepsis at this point. So I was being treated for pneumonia. I ended up having my baby, but at this point I was almost delusional. And I remember waking up after my baby was born and thinking I was in an African tent. It sounds really crazy to tell you, but I imagined I was in like the middle of the desert in like one of those big white tents with the fans going around. And I remember saying to my husband at the time, like, wow, those fans are huge. And I guess, he thought it was just the exhaustion of having a baby and from having the medication through having the baby. But once I got home with my baby, the next 9 days were where I just really noticed, as my baby was induced at 36 weeks due to ICP. But over the next 9 days, I really deteriorated to the point where when my baby was crying to be breastfed, I was in so much pain to move that I almost couldn't face having to pick him up to breastfeed him. And I'd breastfed my first child, and I felt so awful that I just physically couldn't face breastfeeding my child. But obviously I did, and this pain in my side was so painful that it sounds awful to say it, but I really just thought, I feel like I could just die. I feel like I wish I could die at that point. Even just trying to get out of bed, like the baby was in the Moses basket by the side of my bed, and even just the thought of having to sit up to reach him was so excruciating. And then it was on day 9 after he was born. I remember I'd managed to breastfeed him and put him back, and I was in bed in like my dressing gown, like flannel pajamas, like really attractive, obviously, new mother with flannel pajamas and my dressing gown. I remember being huddled in bed, and my husband came up. And I said, oh my gosh, can you put the heating on? And this was middle of October, but it was really warm. And he said, what are you talking about? It's not cold in our bedroom. And then I just started, like literally as he said, it's not cold, I just started shaking, like my whole body. If you've ever been really cold and your whole body shakes, it just felt like that, but really like from the core of me felt freezing. And so my husband called 111. And they said it does sound strange, so to come to A&E. So my mother came to look after the children, and we went to A&E that day. And something else strange that now I know was sepsis, but I didn't know at the time. They gave me a urine bottle for a sample. And I drank a bottle of water that morning and trying to like stay calm and hydrated, and I couldn't give a urine sample. And I found out afterwards that can be a symptom of sepsis. And I remember saying and then I remember getting another bottle from the vending machine and like downing a bottle of water because I was desperate to give this sample to try and find out what was wrong with me, because at this point still no diagnosis had been made. And so that was really unusual. I remember feeling really disappointed in myself that I couldn't give a urine sample. And then I remember it just seemed to take hours of sitting around in the hospital, no one really knowing what was wrong. And then a doctor came and said, look, I don't think it's the pneumonia. The pneumonia medication isn't working. And I always remember this phrase he said, I think the pneumonia is a red herring. And so he knew there was something else that was the problem. So he asked for an MRI scan. And when I went through the scan, they found a kidney abscess on the side where the pain had been. And it turns out it actually, I mean, we don't know the cause of the kidney abscess, but I know UTIs are frequent in pregnancy, and I wonder whether it was related to a UTI. But because this kidney abscess had been unspotted for so long, my whole body was septic. And I remember someone saying to me at the time, like, your face looks so waxy, your face looks so yellow and waxy. And obviously I hadn't had the energy to like do makeup or anything for days. And so at that point, they noticed there was this kidney abscess. The things went quite badly from that point. I ended up having to go into intensive care. I had to have a central line put through my neck. And I was on very strong medication to try and cure the infection. I had a horrible bag thing attached to my side to drain the abscess. And I pretty much went into what I would say like a shock period, where I remember being in intensive care it was a period of 9 days, where I remember not being able to talk and just like look at people. And I remember I was in a bed opposite an elderly man. And I remember watching one evening, a doctor sat with this man for hours, and the man passed away. And it was this doctor with this bushy beard filled in his notes. And then the doctor moved his chair to my bed. And I remember just thinking like, oh, I'm next. Like, I felt like I didn't know if I was going to beat the sepsis or not. And I remember just thinking like, who will look after my children? I remember saying to my husband, like, please just look after my boys for me. And it just, everything was just taking so long, and nothing seemed to be improving for such a long period of time. And you're seeing people die around you, which kind of really, draws your own morale, because you're in the ward of people that are dying. And my breath was still so shallow. And I remember there was a rehab lady that gave me this plastic ball in a tube that I had to blow. And she said, one of the biggest problems can then be a chest infection if you're not breathing properly. So I had to work with that. But also then I had 2 blood transfusions because my blood had been so thinned out by the medication. So this whole thing took 9 days. And then I just remember at that point where they started to see results and improvements, and I started to feel better. But I think it's also amazing how even just not being able to move for a period of 9 days, which is relatively short in our lives, I already couldn't walk independently again, and I had to have support with walking over the next kind of few days. And I think what I didn't realize about sepsis was the mental effect it would have on me. So obviously my body was totally drained, and like at one point I was a shell just attached to machines. But part of the sepsis for me was a lot of hallucinations. And I remember I was convinced one of the nurses was trying to poison me. And every time she came to change the fluids that were attached to my neck, I was convinced she was attaching a poisoned bag. And I remember, because I couldn't really talk at this point, and I remember just always trying to like smile, like muster up a smile for her, like, and try and look at her and smile and think, oh, maybe she'll decide not to poison me. and it sounds really crazy now to think that I was thinking these things. And it was so amazing when they finally started to disconnect everything. So disconnect the bags and disconnect, the catheter and the neck taps, and I hadn't really seen my baby. He was allowed to visit on day 9. So that was like the added trauma, I think, of maternal sepsis, because I was going to breastfeed him. My first child I breastfed to 10 months exclusively, and then my second child I had the same plan. And obviously because of the antibiotics that was so strong to cure the kidney abscess and the infection, I actually couldn't supply milk anymore. So like my milk supply totally dried up. So literally that day I was hospitalized. My husband had to go to Tesco and just buy powdered milk and bottles, like something we'd never used, and try and figure out how to feed the baby, keep the baby alive. But luckily he did. And I remember, I think that was one of the hardest things for me, because I'd been separated from the family. When I finally saw my son, so he was 9 days old no, he must have been 18 days old when I saw him again. I remember holding my son and he just smelt really foreign. Like he hadn't been around me. I hadn't really held him, because I went into hospital when he was 9 days old and then saw him again when he was 18 days old. And he just didn't smell familiar, and he didn't seem familiar to me. And I think that's probably one of the hardest things, because he was my baby, but he just felt really foreign. The main thing that I would change, if I could talk to myself at that time, would be seek some help, like for my mental health, because I think I left hospital just so happy to be home with my family after what seemed forever. Even though it was only 9 days in hospital, it seemed like forever. And I was so determined to come back and start building my attachment with my baby and to be with my older son. So I think I didn't realize how useful it would have been to talk to people about this experience. And I think a lot of people around me didn't want to bring it up, because they knew that I was, focused on my son now, and we want to focus on happy times and having a new baby. Everyone's coming to visit and see the baby, and they don't want to really ask about, when you had all the things attached to you and nearly died. So I think a lot of people, although they were trying to be kind by not asking about the sepsis and my recovery, I think I wish that I had spoken about it more, because even now, 8 years later, I would say it's only in the past, I don't know, 6 months maybe, that I've actually started putting it on my social media, started talking about it. I think for me, I wish I'd spoken more at the time. And for anyone who ends up going through sepsis, like, please just speak out and talk to people. And I think, yeah, that's the main thing that I would change. But it surprises me how many people I talk to haven't heard of sepsis or don't really understand what it is. I mean, even when I look at my own journey, how many people didn't even ask, could it be sepsis? I mean, nobody, until that doctor who said that he thought the pneumonia was a red herring. Nobody had mentioned sepsis. So I think just growing that awareness is so valuable.